The Fallen Leaves by Wilkie Collins. Book 4, Chapter 1. In an interval of no more than 3 weeks, what events may not present themselves? What changes may not take place? Behold Emilius, on the first drizzling day of November, established in respectable lodgings at a moderate weekly rent. He stands before his small fireside and warms his back with an Englishman's severe sense of enjoyment. The cheap-looking glass on the mantelpiece reflects the head and shoulders of a new Emilius. His habits are changed. His social position is in course of development. Already he is a strict economist. Before long he expects to become a married man. It is good to be economical. It is, perhaps, better still to be the accepted husband of a handsome young woman. But for all that, a man in a state of moral improvement, with prospects which his less favored fellow creatures may reasonably envy, is still a man subject to the mischievous mercy of circumstances, and capable of feeling it keenly. The face of the new Emilius wore an expression of anxiety, and more remarkable yet, the temper of the new Emilius was out of order. For the first time in his life he found himself considering trivial questions of sixpences and small favors of discount for cash payments, an irritating state of things in itself. There were more serious anxieties, however, to trouble him than these. He had no reason to complain of the beloved object herself. Not 12 hours since he had said to Regina, with a voice that faltered and a heart that beat wildly, "Are you fond enough of me to let me marry you?" And she had answered placidly, with a heart that would have satisfied the most exacting stethoscope in the medical profession, "Yes, if you like." There was a moment of rapture when she submitted for the first time to be kissed, and when she consented, on being gently reminded that it was expected of her, to return the kiss, once, and no more. But there was also an attendant train of serious considerations which followed on the heels of Emilius when the kissing was over, and when he had said good-bye for the day. He had 2 women for enemies, both resolutely against him in the matter of his marriage. Regina's correspondent and bosom friend Cecilia, who had begun by disliking him, without knowing why, persisted in maintaining her unfavorable opinion of the new friend of the Farnabys. She was a young married woman, and she had influence over Regina which promised, when the fit opportunity came, to make itself felt. The second, and by far the more powerful hostile influence, was the influence of Mrs. Farnaby. Nothing could exceed the half-sisterly, half-motherly goodwill with which she received Emilius on those rare occasions when they happened to meet, unembarrassed by the presence of a third person in the room. Without actually reverting to what happened between them during their memorable interview, Mrs. Farnaby asked questions, plainly showing that the forlorn hope which she associated with Emilius was a hope still firmly rooted in her mind. "Have you been much about London lately? Have you met with any girls who have taken your fancy? Are you tired of staying in the same place, and are you going to travel soon?" Inquiries such as these she was, sooner or later, sure to make when they were alone, but if Regina happened to enter the room, or if Emilius contrived to find his way to her in some other part of the house, Mrs. Farnaby deliberately shortened the interview and silenced the lovers, still as resolute as ever to keep Emilius exposed to the adventurous freedom of a bachelor's life. For the last week his only opportunities of speaking to Regina had been obtained for him secretly by the well-regarded devotion of her maid, and he had now the prospect before him of asking Mr. Farnaby for the hand of his adopted daughter, with the certainty of the influence of 2 women being used against him, even if he succeeded in obtaining a favorable reception for his proposal from the master of the house. Under such circumstances as these, alone, on a rainy November day in a lodging on the dreary eastward side of Tottenham Court Road, even Emilius bore the aspect of a melancholy man. He was angry with his cigar because it refused to light freely. He was angry with the poor deaf servant of all work, who entered the room after one thumping knock at the door, and made in muffled tones the barbarous announcement, "Here's somebody a-wantin' to see yer." "Who the devil is somebody?" Emilius shouted. "Somebody is a citizen of the United States," answered Rufus, quietly entering the room, "and he's sorry to find Claude A. Goldenheart's temperature at boiling point already." He had not altered in the slightest degree since he had left the steamship at Queenstown. Irish hospitality had not fattened him. The change from sea to land had not suggested to him the slightest alteration in his dress. He still wore the huge felt hat in which he had first presented himself to notice on the deck of the vessel. The maid-of-all-work raised her eyes to the face of the long, lean stranger, overshadowed by the broad-brimmed hat, in reverent amazement. "My love to you, miss," said Rufus, with his customary grave cordiality. "I'll shut the door." Having dismissed the maid with that gentle hint, he shook hands heartily with Emilius. "Well, I call this a juicy morning," he said, just as if they had met at the cabin breakfast table as usual. For the moment at least, Emilius brightened at the sight of his fellow traveller. "I am really glad to see you," he said. "It's lonely in these new quarters, before one gets used to them." Rufus relieved himself of his hat and greatcoat and silently looked about the room. "I'm big in the bones," he remarked, surveying the rickety lodging-house furniture with some suspicion, "and I'm a trifle heavier than I look. I shan't break one of these chairs if I sit down on it, shall I?" Passing round the table, littered with books and letters, in search of the nearest chair, he accidentally brushed against a sheet of paper with writing on it. "Memorandum of friends in London, to be informed of my change of address," he read, looking at the paper as he picked it up with the friendly freedom that characterized him. "You have made pretty good use of your time, my son, since I took my leave of you in Queenstown Harbour. I call this a reasonable long list of acquaintances made by a young stranger in London." "I met with an old friend of my family in the hotel," Emilius explained. "He was a great loss to my poor father when he got an appointment in India, and now he has returned. He has been equally kind to me. I am indebted to his introduction for most of the names on that list." "Yes," said Rufus in an interrogative tone of a man who was waiting to hear more. "I'm listening, though I may not look like it. Get along." Emilius looked at his visitor, wondering in what precise direction he was to get along. "I'm no friend of partial information," Rufus proceeded. "I like to round it off complete, as it were, in my own mind. There are names on this list that you haven't accounted for yet. Who provided you, sir, with the balance of your new friends?" Emilius answered not very willingly. "I met them at Mr. Farnaby's house." Rufus looked up from the list with an air of a man surprised by disagreeable information and unwilling to receive it too readily. "How?" he exclaimed, using the old English equivalent, often heard in America, for the modern "what?" "I met them at Mr. Farnaby's," Emilius repeated. "Did you happen to receive a letter of my writing, dated Dublin?" Rufus asked. "Yes." "Do you set any particular value on my advice?" "Certainly." "And you cultivate social relationships with Farnaby and family notwithstanding?" "I have motives for being friendly with them, which I haven't had time to explain to you yet." Rufus stretched out his long legs on the floor and fixed his shrewd, grave eyes steadily on Emilius. "My friend," he said quietly, "in respect of personal appearance and pleasing elasticity of spirits, I find you altered for the worse. I do. It may be liver, or it may be love. I reckon, now I think of it, you're too young yet for liver. It's the brown mist, that's what 'tis. I hate that girl, sir, by instinct." "A nice way of talking of a young lady you've never saw," Emilius broke out. Rufus smiled grimly. "Go ahead," he said. "If you can get vent in quarreling with me, go ahead, my son." He looked round the room again with his hands in his pockets, whistling. Descending to the table in due course of time, his quick eye detected a photograph placed on the open writing desk which Emilius had been using earlier in the day. Before it was possible to stop him, the photograph was in his hand. "I believe I've got her likeness," he announced. "I do assure you I take pleasure in making her acquaintance in this sort of way. Well, now, I declare she is a columnar creature. Yes, sir, I do justice to your native produce, your fine, fleshy, beef-fed English girl. But I tell you this, after a child or two, that sort runs to fat, and you find you have married more of her than you bargained for. To what lengths may you have proceeded, Emilius, with this splendid and spanking person?" Emilius was on the verge of taking offense. "Speak of her respectfully," he said, "if you expect me to answer you." Rufus stared in astonishment. "I'm paying her all manner of compliments," he protested. "And you're not satisfied yet? My friend, I still find something about you on this occasion which reminds me of meat cut against the grain. You're almost nasty, you are. The air of London, I reckon, isn't at all the thing for you. Well, it don't matter to me. I like you. Afloat or ashore, I like you. Do you want to know what I should do in your place if I found myself steering a little too nigh to the brown mist? I should, well, to put it in one word, I should scatter. Where's the harm, I ask you, if you try another girl or two before you make your mind up? I shall be proud to introduce you to our slim and snaky sort at Cool Spring. Yes, I mean what I say, and I'll go back with you across the pond." Referring in this disrespectful manner to the Atlantic Ocean, Rufus offered his hand in a token of unalterable devotion and goodwill. Who could resist such a man as this? Emilius, always in extremes, wrung his hand with an impetuous sense of shame. "I've been sulky," he said. "I've been rude. I ought to be ashamed of myself, and I am. There's only one excuse for me, Rufus. I love her with all my heart and soul, and I'm engaged to be married to her. And yet, if you understand my way of putting it, in short, I'm in a mess." With this characteristic preface, he described his position as exactly as he could, having due regard to the necessary reserve on the subject of Mrs. Farnaby. Rufus listened with the closest attention from beginning to end, making no attempt to disguise the unfavorable impression which the announcement of the marriage engagement had made on him. When he spoke next, instead of looking at Emilius as usual, he held his head down and looked gloomily at his boots. "Well," he said, "you've gone ahead this time, and that's a fact. She didn't raise any difficulties that a man could ride off on, did she?" "She was all that was sweet and kind," Emilius answered with enthusiasm. "She was all that was sweet and kind," Rufus absently repeated, still intent on the solid spectacle of his own boots. "And how about Uncle Farnaby? Perhaps he's sweet and kind likewise, or perhaps he cuts up rough? Possible, is it not, sir?" "I don't know. I haven't spoken to him yet." Rufus suddenly looked up. A faint gleam of hope irradiated his long, lank face. "Mercy be praised, there's a last chance for you," he remarked. "Uncle Farnaby may say no." "It doesn't matter what he says," Emilius rejoined. "She's old enough to choose for herself. He can't stop the marriage." Rufus lifted one wiry yellow forefinger in a state of perpendicular protest. "He cannot stop the marriage," the sagacious New Englander admitted, "but he can stop the money, my son. Find out how you stand with him before another day is over your head." "I can't go to him this evening," said Emilius. "He dines out." "Where is he now?" "At his place of business." "Fix him at his place of business, right away!" cried Rufus, springing with sudden energy to his feet. "I don't think he would like that," Emilius objected. "He's not a very pleasant fellow anywhere, but he's particularly disagreeable at his place of business." Rufus walked to the window and looked out. The objections to Mr. Farnaby appeared to fail so far in interesting him. "To put it plainly," Emilius went on, "there's something about him I can't endure, and, though he's very civil to me in his way, I don't think he has ever got over the discovery that I am a Christian socialist." Rufus abruptly turned round from the window and became attentive again. "So you told him that, did you?" he said. "Of course," Emilius rejoined sharply. "Do you suppose I'm ashamed of the principles on which I have been brought up?" "You don't care, I reckon, if all the world knows your principles," persisted Rufus, deliberately leading him on. "Care?" Emilius reiterated. "I only wish I had all the world to listen to me. They should hear of my principles with no bated breath, I promise you." There was a pause. Rufus turned back again to the window. "When Farnaby's at home, where does he live?" he asked suddenly, still keeping his face towards the street. Emilius mentioned the address. "You don't mean you're going to call there?" he inquired with some anxiety. "Well, I reckoned I might catch him before dinner time. You seem to be sort of feared to speak to him yourself. I'm your friend, Emilius, and I'll speak for you." The bare idea of the interview struck Emilius with terror. "No, no," he said. "I'm much obliged to you, Rufus, but in a matter of this sort I shouldn't like to transfer the responsibility to my friend. I'll speak to Mr. Farnaby in a day or two." Rufus was evidently not satisfied with this. "I do suppose now," he suggested, "you're not the only man moving in this metropolis who fancies Miss Regina. Query, my son, if you put off Farnaby much longer—" He paused and looked at Emilius. "Ah," he said, "I reckon I needn't enlarge further. There is another man. Well, it's the same in my country. I don't know what he does. With you, he always turns up with us, just at the time when you least want to see him." There was another man, an older and a richer man than Emilius, equally assiduous in his attentions to the aunt and to the niece, submissively polite to his favored young rival. He was the sort of person in age and in temperament who would be perfectly capable of advancing his own interests by means of the hostile influence of Mrs. Farnaby. Who could say what the result might be if, by some unlucky accident, he made the attempt before Emilius had secured for himself the support of the master of the house? In his present condition of nervous irritability, he was ready to believe in any coincidence of the disastrous sort. The wealthy rival was a man of business, a near-city neighbor of Mr. Farnaby. They might be together at that moment, and Regina's fidelity to her lover might be put to a harder test than she was prepared to endure. Emilius remembered the gentle conciliatory smile, too gentle by half, with which his placid mistress had received his first kisses, and without stopping to weigh conclusions, snatched up his hat. "Wait for me, Rufus, like a good fellow. I'm off to the stationer's shop." With those parting words, he hurried out of the room. Left by himself, Rufus began to rummage the pockets of his frock coat, a long, loose, and dingy garment, which had become friendly and comfortable to him by dint of ancient use. Producing a handful of correspondence, he selected the largest envelope of all, shook out on the table several smaller letters enclosed, picked one out of the number, and read the concluding paragraph only with the closest attention. "I enclose letters of introduction to the securities of literary institutions in London, and in some of the principal cities of England. If you feel disposed to lecture yourself, or if you can persuade friends and citizens known to you to do so, I believe it may be in your power to advance in this way the interests of our Bureau. Please take notice that the more advanced institutions, which are ready to countenance and welcome free thought in religion, politics, and morals, are marked on the envelopes with a cross in red ink. The envelopes without a mark are addressed to platforms on which the customary British prejudices remain rampant, and in which the charge for places reaches a higher figure than can be as yet obtained in the sanctuaries of free thought." Rufus laid down the letter, and choosing one among the envelopes marked in red ink, looked at the introduction enclosed. "If the right sort of invitation reached Emilius from this institution," he thought, "the boy would lecture on Christian socialism with all his heart and soul. I wonder what the Brown miss and her uncle would say to that." He smiled to himself and put the letter back in the envelope and considered the subject for a while. Below the odd rough surface he was a man in 10,000. No more single-hearted and more affectionate creature ever breathed the breath of life. He had not been understood in his own little circle. There had been a want of sympathy with him, and even a want of knowledge of him at home. Emilius, popular with everyone, had touched the great heart of this man. He perceived the peril that lay hidden under the strange and lonely position of his fellow voyager. So innocent in the ways of the world, so young and so easily impressed, his fondness for Emilius, it is hardly too much to say, was the fondness of a father for his son. With a sigh he shook his head and gathered up his letters and put them back in his pockets. "No, not yet," he decided. "The poor boy really loves her, and the girl may be good enough to make the happiness of his life." He got up and walked about the room. Suddenly he stopped, struck by a new idea. "Why, shouldn't I judge for myself?" he thought. "I've got the address. I reckon I'll look in on the Farnabys in a friendly way." He sat down at the desk and wrote a line in the event of Emilius being the first to return to the lodgings. "Dear boy, I don't find her photograph tells me quite so much as I want to know. I have a mind to see the living original. Being your friend, you know, it's only civil to pay my respects to the family. Expect my unbiased opinion when I come back. Yours, Rufus." Having enclosed and addressed these lines, he took up his greatcoat and checked himself in the act of putting it on. The Brown miss was a British miss. A strange New Englander had better be careful of his personal appearance before he ventured into her presence. Urged by this cautious motive, he approached the looking-glass and surveyed himself critically. "I doubt I might be better, it occurred to me, if I brushed my hair and smelt a little of perfume. Yes, I'll make a toilet. Where's the boy's bedroom, I wonder?" He observed a second door in the sitting-room and opened it at hazard. Fortune had befriended him so far. He found himself in his young friend's bedchamber. The toilet of Emilius, simple as it was, had its mysteries for Rufus. He was at a loss among the perfumes. They were all contained in a modest little dressing-case, without labels of any sort to describe the contents of the pots and bottles. He examined them one after another, and stopped at some recently invented French shaving cream. "It smells lovely," he said, assuming it to be some rare pomatum. "Just what I want, it seems, for my head." He rubbed the shaving cream into his bristly iron-gray hair until his arms ached. When he had next sprinkled his handkerchief and himself profusely, first with rosewater, and then, to make quite sure, with eau de cologne used as a climax, he felt that he was in a position to appeal agreeably to the senses of the softer sex. In 5 minutes more he was on his way to Mr. Farnaby's private residence. Chapter 2. The rain that had begun with the morning still poured on steadily in the afternoon. After one look out of the window, Regina decided on passing the rest of the day luxuriously, in the company of a novel by her own fireside. With her feet on the tender, and her head on the soft cushion of her favorite easy-chair, she opened the book. Having read the first chapter and part of the second, she was just lazily turning over the leaves in search of a love scene, when her languid interest in the novel was suddenly diverted to an incident in real life. The sitting-room door was gently opened, and her maid appeared in a state of modest confusion. "If you please, miss, here's a strange gentleman who comes from Mr. Goldenheart's. He wishes particularly to say—" She paused and looked behind her. A faint and curious smell of mingled soap and scent entered the room, followed closely by a tall, calm, shabbily dressed man, who laid a wiry yellow hand on the maid's shoulder and stopped her effectually before she could say a word more. "Don't you think of troubling yourself to get through with it, my dear. I'm here, and I'll finish for you." Addressing the maid in these encouraging terms, the stranger advanced to Regina and actually attempted to shake hands with her. Regina rose and looked at him. It was a look that ought to have daunted the boldest man living. It produced no sort of effect on this man. He still held out his hand. His lean face broadened with a pleasant smile. "My name is Rufus Dingwell," he said. "I come from Cool Spring, Massachusetts, and Emilius is my introduction to yourself and family." Regina silently acknowledged this information by a frigid bow, and addressed herself to the maid waiting at the door. "Don't leave the room, Phoebe." Rufus, inwardly wondering what Phoebe was wanted for, proceeded to express the cordial sentiments proper to the occasion. "I have heard about you, miss, and I take pleasure in making your acquaintance." The unwritten laws of politeness obliged Regina to say something. "I have not heard Mr. Goldenheart mention your name," she remarked. "Are you an old friend of his?" Rufus explained with genial alacrity. "We crossed the pond together, miss. I like the boy. He's bright and spry. He refreshes me, he does. We go ahead with most things in my country, and friendship's one of them. How do you find yourself? Won't you shake hands?" He took her hand without waiting to be repelled this time, and shook it with the heartiest goodwill. Regina shuddered faintly. She summoned assistance in case of further familiarity. "Phoebe, tell my aunt." Rufus added a message on his account. "And say this, my dear, I sincerely desire to make the acquaintance of Miss Regina's aunt, and any other members of the family circle." Phoebe left the room, smiling. Such an amusing visitor as this was a rare person in Mr. Farnaby's house. Rufus looked after her with unconcealed approval. The maid appeared to be more to his taste than the mistress. "Well, that's a pretty creature, I do declare," he said to Regina. "Reminds me of our American girl, slim in the waist and carries her head nicely. How old may she be now?" Regina expressed her opinion of this familiar question by pointing, with silent dignity, to a chair. "Thank you, miss. Not that one," said Rufus. "You see, I'm long in the legs, and if once I get down as low as that, I reckon I should have to restore the balance by putting my feet up on the grate, and that's not manners in Great Britain, and quite right, too." He picked up the highest chair he could find, and admired the workmanship as he drew it up to the fireplace. "Most sumptuous and elegant," he said, "the style of the Renaissance, as they call it." Regina observed with dismay that he had not got his hat in his hand like other visitors. He had left it no doubt in the hall. He looked as if he had dropped in to spend the day and stay to dinner. "Well, miss, I've seen your photograph," he resumed, "and I don't much approve of it, now I see you. My sentiments are not altogether favorable to that art. I delivered a lecture on photographic portraiture in Cool Spring, and I described it briefly as justice without mercy. The audience took the idea. They larfed, they did. Larfin reminds me of Emilius. Do you object to his being a Christian socialist, miss?" The lady's look when she answered this question was not lost on Rufus. He registered it mentally in case of need. "Emilius will soon get over all that nonsense," she said, "when he has been a little longer in London." "Possible," Rufus admitted. "The boy is fond of you. Yes, he loves you. I have noticed him, and I can certify to that. I may also remark that he wants a deal of love in return. No doubt, miss, you have observed that circumstance yourself?" Regina resented this last inquiry as an outrage on propriety. "What next will he say?" she thought to himself. "I must put this presuming man in his proper place." She darted another annihilating look at him as she spoke in her turn. "May I ask Mr.
Dingwell?"
said Rufus, prompting her. "May I ask, Mr. Dingwell, if you have favored me by calling here at the request of Mr. Goldenheart?" Genial and simple-minded as he was, eagerly as he desired to appreciate at her full value the lady who was one day to be the wife of Emilius, Rufus felt the tone in which these words were spoken. It was not easy to stimulate his modest sense of what was fairly due to him into asserting itself, but the cold distrust, the deliberate distance of Regina's manner, exhausted the long-suffering indulgence of the singularly patient man.
"The Lord in his mercy preserve Emilius from marrying you," he thought as he rose from his chair and advanced with certain simple dignity to take leave of her. "It did not occur to me, miss, to pay my respects to you till Emilius and I had parted company," he said. "Please to excuse me, I should have been welcome in my country with no better introduction than being, as I may say, his friend and well-wisher. If I have made a mistake—"
He stopped. Regina had suddenly changed color. Instead of looking at him, she was looking over his shoulder, apparently at something behind him. He turned to see what it was. A lady, short and stout, with strange, wild, sorrowful eyes, had noiselessly entered the room while he was speaking. She was waiting, as it seemed, until he had finished what he had said. When they confronted each other, she moved to meet him with a firm, heavy step, and with her hand held out in token of welcome.
"You may feel equally sure, sir, of a friendly reception here," she said in her steady, self-possessed way. "I am this young lady's aunt, and I am glad to see the friend of Emilius in my house."
Before Rufus could answer, she turned to Regina.
"I waited," she went on, "to give you an opportunity of explaining yourself to this gentleman. I am afraid he has mistaken your coldness of manner for intentional rudeness."
The color rushed back into Regina's face. She vibrated for a moment between anger and tears, but the better nature in her broke its way through the constitutional shyness and restraint which habitually kept it down.
"I meant no harm, sir," she said, raising her large, beautiful eyes submissively to Rufus. "I am not used to receiving strangers. And you did ask me some very strange questions," she added with a sudden burst of self-assertion. "Strangers are not in the habit of saying such things in England."
She looked at Mrs. Farnaby, listening with impenetrable composure, and stopped in confusion. Her aunt would not scruple to speak to the stranger about Emilius in her presence. There was no knowing what she might not have to endure. She turned to Rufus.
"Excuse me," she said. "If I leave you with my aunt, I have an engagement."
With that trivial apology, she made her escape from the room.
"She has no engagement," Mrs. Farnaby briefly remarked as the door closed. "Sit down, sir."
For once, even Rufus was not at his ease.
"I can hit it off, ma'am, with most people," he said. "I wonder what I've done to offend your niece?" "My niece, with many good qualities, is a narrow-minded young woman," Mrs. Farnaby explained. "You are not like the men she is accustomed to see. She doesn't understand you. You are not a commonplace gentleman. For instance," Mrs. Farnaby continued with the matter-of-fact gravity of a woman innately inaccessible to a sense of humor, You have got something strange on your hair. It seems to be melting, and it smells like soap. No, it's no use taking out your handkerchief. Your handkerchief won't mop it up. Oh, get a towel." She opened an inner door which disclosed a little passage and a bathroom beyond it. "I'm the strongest person in the house," she resumed, returning with the towel in her hand as gravely as ever. "Sit still, and don't make apologies. If any of us can rub you dry, I'm the woman." She set to work with the towel as if she had been Rufus's mother, making him presentable in the days of his boyhood. Giddy under the violence of the rubbing, staggered by the contrast between the cold reception accorded to him by the niece and the more than friendly welcome offered by the aunt, Rufus submitted to circumstances in docile and silent bewilderment. "There, you'll do good till you get home. Nobody can laugh at you now," Mrs. Farnaby announced. "You're an absent-minded man, I suppose. You wanted to wash your head, and you forgot the warm water in the towel. Was that how it happened, sir?" "I thank you with all my heart, ma'am. I took it for pomatum," Rufus answered. "Would you object to shaking hands again? This cordial welcome of yours reminds me, I do assure you, of home. Since I left New England, I've never met the like of you. I do suppose now it was my hair that set Miss Regina's back up. I'm not quite easy in my mind, ma'am, about your niece. I sort of feared of what she may say of me to Emilius. I meant no harm, Lord knows." The secret of Mrs. Farnaby's extraordinary alacrity in the use of the towel began slowly to show itself now. The tone of her American guest had already become the friendly and familiar tone which it had been her object to establish. With a little management he might be made an invaluable ally in the great work of hindering the marriage of Emilius. "You're very fond of your young friend?" she began quietly. "That is so, ma'am." "And he has told you that he has taken a liking to my niece?" "And shown me her likeness," Rufus added. "And shown you her likeness? And you thought you would come here and see for yourself what sort of girl she was?" "Naturally," Rufus admitted. Mrs. Farnaby revealed without further hesitation the object that she had in view. "Emilius is little more than a lad still," she said. "He has got all his life before him. It would be a sad thing if he married a girl who didn't make him happy." She turned in her chair and pointed to the door by which Regina had left them. "Between ourselves," she resumed, dropping her voice to a whisper, "do you believe my niece will make him happy?" Rufus hesitated. "I'm above family prejudices," Mrs. Farnaby proceeded. "You needn't be afraid of offending me. Speak out." Rufus would have spoken out to any other woman in the universe. This woman had preserved him from ridicule. This woman had rubbed his head dry. He prevaricated. "I don't suppose I understand the ladies in this country," he said, but Mrs. Farnaby was not to be trifled with. "If Emilius was your son, and if he asked you to consent to marriage with my niece," she rejoined, "would you say yes?" This was too much for Rufus. "Not if he went down on both his knees to ask me," he answered. Mrs. Farnaby was satisfied at last, and owned it without reserve. "My own opinion," she said, "exactly expressed. Don't be surprised. Didn't I tell you I had no family prejudices? Do you know if he has spoken to my husband yet?" Rufus looked at his watch. "I reckon he's just about done it by this time." Mrs. Farnaby paused and reflected for a moment. She had already attempted to prejudice her husband against Emilius, and had received an answer which Mr. Farnaby considered to be final. "Mr. Goldenheart honors us if he seeks our alliance. He is the representative of an old English family." Under these circumstances it was quite possible that the proposals of Emilius had been accepted. Mrs. Farnaby was not the less determined that the marriage should never take place, and not the less eager to secure the assistance of her new ally. "When will Emilius tell you about it?" she asked. "When I go back to his lodgings, ma'am." "Go back at once, and bear this in mind as you go. If you can find out any likely way of parting these two young people, in their own best interests, depend on one thing, if I can help you I will. I'm as fond of Emilius as you are. Ask him if I haven't done my best to keep him away from my niece. Ask him if I haven't expressed my opinion that she's not the right wife for him. Come and see me again as soon as you like. I'm fond of Americans. Good morning."
Rufus attempted to express his sense of gratitude in his own briefly eloquent way. He was not allowed a hearing. With one and the same action, Mrs. Farnaby patted him on the shoulder and pushed him out of the room.
"If that woman was an American citizen," Rufus reflected on his way through the streets, "she'd be the first female president of the United States."
His admiration of Mrs. Farnaby's energy and resolution expressed in these strong terms acknowledged but one limit. Highly as he approved of her, there was nevertheless an unfathomable something in the woman's eyes that disturbed and daunted him. Chapter 3. Rufus found his friend at the lodgings, prostrate on the sofa, smoking furiously. Before a word had passed between them, it was plain to the New Englander that something had gone wrong.
"Well," he asked, "and what does Farnaby say?"
"Damn Farnaby!" Rufus was secretly conscious of an immense sense of relief.
"I call that a stiff way of putting it," he quietly remarked, "but the meaning's clear. Farnaby has said no."
Emilius jumped off the sofa and planted himself defiantly on the hearth-rug. "You're wrong for once," he said with a bitter laugh. "The exacerbating part of it is that Farnaby has said neither yes or no. The oily, whiskered brute, you haven't seen him yet, have you, began by saying yes. A man like me, the heir of a fine old English family, honored him by making proposals. He could wish no more brilliant prospect for his dear adopted child. She would fill the high position that was offered to her, and fill it worthily. That was the fawning way in which he talked to me at first. He squeezed my hand in his horrid, cold, shiny paw till, I give you my word of honor, I felt as if I were going to be sick. Wait a little, you haven't heard the worst of it yet. He soon altered his tone. It began with his asking me if I had considered the question of settlements. I didn't know what he meant. He had to put it in plain English. He wanted to hear what my property was. Oh, that's soon settled, I said. I've got $500 a year, and Regina's welcome to every farthing of it. He fell back in his chair as if I had shot him. He turned, it was worse than pale, he was positively turned green. At first he wouldn't believe me. He declared I must be joking. I set him right about that immediately. His next change was a proud impudence. Have you not observed, sir, in what style Regina is accustomed to live in my house? $500 a year! Good heavens! With strict economy, $500 a year might pay her milliner's bill and the keep of her horse and carriage. Who is to pay for everything else? The establishment, the dinner parties and balls, the tour abroad, the children, the nurses, the doctor. I tell you this, Mr. Goldenheart, I'm willing to make a sacrifice to you, as a born gentleman, which I would certainly not consent to, in the case of any self-made man. Enlarge your income, sir, to no more than 4 times £500, and I guarantee you a yearly allowance to Regina of half as much again, besides the fortune which she will inherit at my death. That will make your income 3,000 a year to start with. I know something of domestic expenses, and I tell you positively, you can't do it with a farthing less." That was his language, Rufus. The insolence of his tone I can't attempt to describe. If I hadn't thought of Regina, I should have behaved in a manner unworthy of a Christian. I believe I should have taken my walking cane and given him a sound thrashing. Rufus neither expressed surprise nor offered advice. He was lost in meditation on the wealth of Mr. Farnaby.
"A stationer's business seems to eventuate in a lively profit in this country," he said.
"A stationer's business?" Emilius repeated disdainfully. "Farnaby has half a dozen irons in the fire besides that. He's got a newspaper and a patent medicine and a new bank, and I don't know what else. One of his friends said to me, 'Nobody knows whether Farnaby is rich or poor. He's going to do one of 2 things. He's going to die worth millions or to die bankrupt.' Oh, if I can only live to see the day when socialism will put that sort of man in his right place."
"Try a republic on our model first," said Rufus. "When Farnaby talks of the style his young woman is accustomed to live in, what does he mean?"
"He means," Emilius answered smartly, "a carriage to live in, champagne on the table, and a footman to answer the door."
"Farnaby's ideas, sir, have crossed the water and landed in New York," Rufus remarked. "Well, and what did you say to him on your side?"
"I gave it to him, I tell you. That's all ostentation. I said, why can't Regina and I begin life modestly? What do we want with a carriage to drive out in, and champagne on the table and a footman to answer the door? We want to love each other and be happy. There are thousands of as good gentlemen as I am in England with wives and families who would ask for nothing better than an income of $500 a year. The fact is, Mr. Farnaby, you're positively saturated with the love of money. Get your New Testament and read what Christ says of rich people. What do you think he did when I put it in that unanswerable way? He held up his hand and looked horrified. "I can't allow profanity in my office," he said. "I have my New Testament to read to me in church, sir, every Sunday. That's the sort of Christian, Rufus, who is the average product of modern times. He was as obstinate as a mule. He wouldn't give up a single inch. His adopted daughter, he said, was accustomed to live in a certain style. In that same style she should live when she was married, so long as he had a voice in the matter. Of course, if she chose to set his wishes and feelings at defiance in return for all that he had done for her, she was old enough to take her own way. In that case he would tell me as plainly as I meant to tell her, that she must not look to a single farthing of his money to help her, and not to expect to find her name down in his will. He felt the honour of a family alliance with me as sincerely as ever, but he must abide by the conditions that he had stated. On those terms he would be proud to give me the hand of Regina at the altar, and proud to feel that he had done his duty by his adopted child. I let him go on till he had run himself out, and then I answered quietly if he could tell me the way to increase my income to 200,000 a year. How do you think he answered me?"
"Perhaps he offered to utilize your capital in his business?" Rufus guessed.
"Not he. He considered business quite beneath me. My duty to myself as a gentleman was to adopt a profession. On reflection, it turned out that there was but one likely profession to try in my case, the law. I might be called to the bar, and with luck I might get remunerative work to do in 8 or 10 years' time. That, I declare to you, was the prospect he set before me if I chose to take his advice. I asked him if he was joking. Certainly not. I was only 21 years old, he reminded me. I had plenty of time to spare. I should still marry young if I married at 30. I took up my hat and gave him a bit of my mind at parting. If you really mean anything, I said, you mean that Regina is to pine and to fade and to become a middle-aged woman, and that I am to resist the temptations that beset a young man in London, and lead the life of a monk for the next 10 years. And all for what? For a carriage to ride out in, champagne on the table, and a footman to answer the door? Keep your money, Mr. Farnaby. Regina and I will do without it. What are you laughing at? I don't think you could have put it more strongly yourself."
Rufus suddenly recovered his gravity. "I tell you this, Emilius," he replied. "You afford, as we say in my country, meaty fruit for reflection, you do."
"What do you mean by that?"
"Well, I reckon you remember when we were aboard the boat, you gave us a narrative of what happened in that community of yours, which I can truly characterize as a combination of native eloquence and chastity and good sense. I put the question to myself, sir, what has become of that well-informed and discreet young Christian, now he has changed the spear to England, and mixed with the Farnabys? Is it not to be denied that I see him before me in the flesh when I look across the table here, but it's equally true that I miss him altogether in the spirit?"
Emilius sat down again on the sofa. "In plain words," he said, "you think I've behaved like a fool in this matter?" Rufus crossed his long legs and nodded his head in silent approval. Instead of taking offense, Emilius considered a little. "It didn't strike me before," he said, "but now you mention it, I can understand that I appear to be a simple sort of fellow in what is called society here, and the reason I suspect is that it's not the society in which I've been accustomed to mix. The Farnabys are new to me, Rufus. When it comes to a question of my life at Tadmor, of what I saw and learnt and felt in the community, then I can think and speak like a reasonable being, because I am thinking and speaking of what I know thoroughly well. Hang it, make some allowance for the difference of circumstances. Besides, I'm in love, and that alters a man, and I have heard some people say not always for the better. Anyhow, I've done it with Farnaby, and it can't be undone. There will be no peace for me now until I have spoken to Regina. I have read the note you left me. Did you see her when you called at the house?" The quiet tone in which this question was put surprised Rufus. He had fully expected, after Regina's reception of him, to be called to account for the liberty he had taken. Emilius was too completely absorbed by his present anxieties to consider trivial questions of etiquette. Hearing that Rufus had seen Regina, he never even asked for his friend's opinion of her. His mind was full of the obstacles that might be interposed to his seeing her again. "Farnaby is sure, after what has passed between us, to keep her out of my way if he can," Emilius said, "and Mrs. Farnaby, to my certain knowledge, will help him. They don't suspect you. Couldn't you call again? You're old enough to be her father, and make some excuse to take her out with you for a walk?" The answer of Rufus to this was Roman in its brevity. He pointed to the window and said, "Look at the rain." "Then I must try her maid once more," said Emilius resignedly. He took his hat and umbrella. "Don't leave me, old fellow," he resumed as he opened the door. "This is the turning point of my life. I'm sorely in need of a friend."
"Do you think she will marry you against the will of her uncle and aunt?" Rufus asked.
"I am certain of it," Emilius answered. With that he left the room. Rufus looked after him sadly. Sympathy and sorrow were expressed in every line of his rugged face.
My poor boy, how will he bear it if she says no? What will become of him if she says yes?
He rubbed his hand irritably across his forehead like a man whose own thoughts were repellent to him. In a moment more he plunged into his pockets and drew out again the letters introducing him to the secretaries of public institutions.
If there's salvation for Emilius, he said, I reckon I shall find it here.
Chapter 4. The medium of correspondence between Emilius and Regina's maid was an old woman who kept a shop for the sale of newspapers and periodicals in a by-street not far from Mr. Farnaby's house. From this place his letters were delivered to the maid, under cover of the morning newspapers, and here he found the answers waiting for him later in the day.
If Rufus could only have taken her out for a walk, I might have seen Regina this afternoon, thought Emilius. As it is, I may have to wait till tomorrow, or later still, and then there's the sovereign to Phoebe.
He sighed as he thought of the fee. Sovereigns were becoming scarce in our young socialist's purse. Arriving in sight of the news vendor's shop, Emilius noticed a man leaving it, who walked away towards the farther end of the street. When he entered the shop himself a minute afterwards, the woman took up a letter from the counter.
"A young man has just left this for you," she said.
Emilius recognized the maid's handwriting on the address. The man whom he had seen leaving the shop was Phoebe's messenger. He opened the letter. Her mistress, Phoebe explained, was too much flurried to be able to write. The master had astonished the whole household by appearing among them at least 3 hours before the time at which he was accustomed to leave his place of business. He had found Mrs. Ormond, otherwise Regina's friend and correspondent Cecilia, paying a visit to his niece, and had asked to speak with her in private before she took leave. The result was an invitation to Regina, from Mrs. Ormond, to stay for a little while at her house in the neighbourhood of Harrow. The ladies were to leave London together in Mrs. Ormond's carriage that afternoon. Under stress of strong persuasion on the part of her uncle and aunt as well as her friend, Regina had ended in giving way. But she had not forgotten the interests of Emilius. She was willing to see him privately on the next day, provided he left London by the train which reached Harrow soon after the 11 in the forenoon. If it happened to rain, that he must put off his journey until the first fine day, arriving in any case at the same hour. The place at which he was to wait was described to him, and with these instructions the letter ended. The rapidity with which Mr. Farnaby had carried out his resolution to separate the lovers placed the weakness of Regina's character before Emilius in a new and startling light. Why had she not stood on her privileges, as a woman who had arrived at years of discretion, and refused to leave London until she had first heard what her lover had to say? Emilius had left his American friend, feeling sure that Regina's decision would be in his favor, when she was called upon to choose between the man who was ready to marry her and the man who was nothing but her uncle by courtesy. For the first time he now felt that his own confident anticipations might, by bare possibility, deceive him. He returned to his lodgings in such a state of depression that compassionate Rufus insisted on taking him out to dinner, and hurried him off afterwards to the play. Thoroughly prostrated, Emilius submitted to the genial influence of his friend. He had not even energy enough to feel surprised when Rufus stopped on their way to the tavern at a dingy building adorned with a Grecian portico, and left a letter and a card in charge of a servant at the side door. The next day, by a happy interposition of fortune, proved to be a day without rain. Emilius followed his instructions to the letter. A little watery sunshine showed itself as he left the station at Harrow. His mind was still in such a state of doubt and disturbance that it drew from superstition a faint encouragement to hope. He nailed the feeble November sunlight as a good omen. Mr. and Mrs. Ormond's place of residence stood alone, surrounded by its own grounds. A wooden fence separated the property on one side from a muddy little by-road leading to a neighbouring farm. At a wicket gate in this fence, giving admission to a shrubbery situated at some distance from the house, Emilius now waited for the appearance of the maid. After a delay of a few minutes only, the faithful Phoebe arrived at the gate with the key in her hand. "Where is she?" Emilius asked, as the girl opened the gate for him.
"Waiting for you in the shrubbery. Stop, sir. I have something to say to you first."
Emilius took out his purse and produced the fee. Even he had observed that Phoebe was perhaps a little too eager to get her money.
"Thank you, sir. Please to look at your watch. You mustn't be with Miss Regina a moment longer than a quarter of an hour."
"Why not?"
"This is the time, sir, when Mrs. Ormond is engaged every day with her cook and housekeeper. In a quarter of an hour the orders will be given, and Mrs. Ormond will join Miss Regina for a walk in the grounds. You will be the ruin of me, sir, if she finds you here." Without warning, the maid led the way along the winding paths of the shrubbery. "I must thank you for your letter, Phoebe," said Emilius as he followed her. "By the by, who is your messenger?" Phoebe's answer was no answer at all. "Only a young man, sir," she said. "In plain words, your sweetheart, I suppose." Phoebe's expressive silence was her only reply. She turned a corner and pointed to her mistress standing alone before the entrance of a damp and deserted summer-house. Regina put her handkerchief to her eyes when the maid had discreetly retired. "Oh," she said softly, "I am afraid this is very wrong." Emilius removed the handkerchief by the exercise of a little gentle force, and administered comfort under the form of a kiss. Having opened the proceedings in this way, he put his first question. "Why did you leave London?" "How could I help it?" said Regina feebly. "They were all against me. What else could I do?" It occurred to Emilius that she might at her age have asserted a will of her own. He kept his idea, however, to himself, and giving her his arm, led her slowly along the path of the shrubbery. "You have heard, I suppose, what Mr. Farnaby expects of me?" he said. "Yes, dear." "I call it worse than mercenary. I call it downright brutal." "Oh, Emilius, don't talk so." Emilius came suddenly to a standstill. "Does that mean you agree with him?" he asked. "Don't be angry with me, dear. I only meant there was some excuse for him." "What excuse?" "Well, you see, he has a high idea of your family, and he thought you were rich people, and I know you didn't mean it, Emilius, but still you did disappoint him." Emilius dropped her arm. The mildly persistent defense of Mr. Farnaby exasperated her. "Perhaps I should have disappointed you," he said. "Oh, no, no. Oh, how cruel you are." The ruddy tears showed themselves again in her magnificent eyes, gentle, considerate tears that raised no storm in her bosom and produced no unbecoming results in her face. "Don't be hard on me," she said, appealing to him helplessly, like a charming, overgrown child. Some men might have still resisted her, but Emilius was not one of them. He took her hand and pressed it tenderly. "Regina," he said, "do you love me?" "You know I do." He put his arm round her waist. He concentrated the passion that was in him into a look, and poured the look into her eyes. "Do you love me as dearly as I love you?" he whispered. She felt it with all the little passion that was in her. After a moment of hesitation, she put one arm timidly round his neck, and bending her grand head, laid it on his bosom. Her finely rounded, supple, muscular figure trembled, as if she had been the most fragile woman living. "Dear Emilius," she murmured inaudibly. He tried to speak to her. His voice failed him. She had, in perfect innocence, fired his young blood. He drew her closer and closer to him. He lifted her head with a masterful resolution that she was not able to resist, and pressed his kisses in hot and breathless succession on her lips. His vehemence frightened her. She tore herself out of his arms with a sudden exertion of strength that took him completely by surprise. "I didn't think you would have been rude to me." With that mild reproach, she turned away and took the path which led from the shrubbery to the house. Emilius followed her, entreating that she would accept his excuses and grant him a few minutes more. He modestly laid all the blame on her beauty, lamented that he had not resolution enough to resist the charm of it. When did that commonplace compliment ever fail to produce its effect? Regina smiled with the weakly complacent good nature which was only saved from being contemptible by its association with her personal attractions. "Will you promise to behave?" she stipulated, and Emilius, not very eagerly, promised. "Shall we go into the summer-house?" he suggested. "It's very damp at this time of year," Regina answered with placid good sense. "Perhaps we might catch cold. We had better walk about." They walked accordingly. "I wanted to speak to you about our marriage," Emilius resumed. She sighed softly. "We have some time to wait," she said, "before we can think of that." He passed this reply over without notice. "You know," he went on, "that I have an income of 500 a year. Yes, dear. There are hundreds of thousands of respectable artisans, Regina, with large families, who live comfortably on less than half my income. Do they, dear? And many gentlemen are not better off. Curates, for instance. Do you see what I am coming to, my Dolly? No, dear. Could you live with me in a cottage in the little country with a nice garden, and one little maid to wait on us, and 2 or 3 new dresses in a year? Regina lifted her fine eyes in sober ecstasy to the sky. It sounds very tempting, she remarked in the sweetest tones of her voice. And it could be done, Emilius proceeded, on 500 a year. Could it, dear? I've calculated it, allowing the necessary margin, and I am sure of what I say, and I have done something else. I have asked about the marriage license. I could easily find lodgings in the neighborhood. We might be married at Harrow in a fortnight. Regina started, her eyes opened widely, and rested on Emilius with an expression of incredulous wonder. Married in a fortnight? She repeated. What would my uncle and aunt say? My angel, our happiness doesn't depend on your uncle and aunt. Our happiness depends on ourselves. Nobody has any power to control us. I am a man and you are a woman, and we have a right to be married whenever we like. Emilius pronounced this last oracular sentence with his head held high and a pleasant inner persuasion of the convincing manner in which he had stated his case. Without my uncle to give me away? Regina exclaimed. Without my aunt? With no bridesmaids, and no friends, and no wedding breakfast? Oh, Emilius, what can you be thinking of? She drew back a step and looked at him in helpless consternation. For the moment, and the moment only, Emilius lost all patience with her. If you really loved me, he said bitterly, you wouldn't think of the bridesmaids and the breakfast. Regina had her answer ready in her pocket. She took out her handkerchief. Before she could lift it to her eyes, Emilius recovered himself. No, no, he said. I didn't mean that. I am sure you love me. Take my arm again. Do you know, Regina, I doubt whether your uncle has told you everything that has passed between us. Are you really aware of the hard terms that he insists on? He expects me to increase my 500 a year to 2,000 before a sanction of marriage. Yes, dear, he has told me that. I have as much chance of earning 1,500 a year, Regina, as I have of being made King of England. Did he tell you that? He doesn't agree with you, dear. He thinks you might earn it, with your abilities in 10 years. This time it was the turn of Emilius to look at Regina in helpless consternation. 10 years, he repeated. Do you coolly contemplate waiting 10 years before we are married? Good heavens! Is it possible that you are thinking of the money? That you can't live without carriages and footmen and ostentation and grandeur? He stopped. For once, even Regina showed that she had spirit enough to be angry. You ought to be ashamed of yourself to speak to me in that way, she broke out indignantly. If you have no better opinion of me than that, I won't marry you at all. No, not if you have 50,000 a year, sir, tomorrow. Am I to have no sense of duty to my uncle, to the good man who was but a second father to me? Do you think I am ungrateful enough to set his wishes at defiance? Oh, yes, I know you don't like him. I know that a great many people don't like him. That doesn't make any difference to me. But for dear Uncle Farnaby, I might have gone to the workhouse. I might have been made a starving needlewoman, a poor, persecuted maid of all work. Am I to forget that, because you have no patience, and only think of yourself? Oh, I wish I had never met with you! I wish I had never been fool enough to be as fond of you as I am. With that confession, she turned her back on him and took refuge in her handkerchief once more. Amelia stood looking at her in silent despair. After the tone in which she had spoken of her obligations to her uncle, it was useless to anticipate any satisfactory result from the exertion of his influence over Regina. Recalling what he had seen and heard in Mrs. Farnaby's room, Emilius could not doubt that the motive of pacifying his wife was the motive which had first led Farnaby to receive Regina into his house. Was it unreasonable or unjust to infer that the orphan child must have been mainly indebted to Mrs. Farnaby's sense of duty to the memory of her sister for the parental protection afforded to her from that time forth? It would have been useless, and worse than useless, to place before Regina such considerations as these. Her exaggerated idea of the gratitude that she owed to her uncle was beyond the limited reach of reason. Nothing was to be gained by opposition, and no sensible course was left but to say some peacemaking words and submit. I beg your pardon, Regina, if I have offended you. You have sadly disappointed me. I haven't deliberately misjudged you. I can say no more. She turned round quickly and looked at him.
There was an ominous change into resignation in his voice. There was a dogged submission in his manner that alarmed her. She had never yet seen him under the perilously patient aspect in which he now presented himself, after his apology had been made. "I forgive you, Emilius, with all my heart," she said, and timidly held out her hand. He took it, raised it silently to his lips, and dropped it again. She suddenly turned pale. All the love that she had in her to give to a man, she had given to Emilius. Her heart sank. She asked herself in blank terror if she had lost him. "I am afraid it is I who have offended you," she said. "Don't be angry with me, Emilius. Don't make me more unhappy than I am." "I'm not in the least angry," he answered, still in the quiet, subdued way that terrified her. "You can't expect me, Regina, to contemplate a 10 years' engagement cheerfully." She took his hand and held it in both her own hands, held it as if his love for her was there and she was determined not to let it go. "If you will only leave it to me," she pleaded, "the engagement shan't be so long as that. Try my uncle with a little kindness and respect, Emilius, instead of saying hard words to him, or let me try him, if you are too proud to give way. May I say that you have no intention of offending him, and that you are willing to leave the future to me?" "Certainly," said Emilius, "if you think it will be of the slightest use." His tone added plainly, "I don't believe in your uncle, mind, as you do." She still persisted. "It will be of the greatest use," she went on. "He will let me go home again, and he will not object to your coming to see me. He doesn't like to be despised and set at defiance. Who does? Be patient, Emilius, and I will persuade him to expect less money from you. Only what you may earn, dear, with your talents, long before 10 years have passed." She waited for a word of reply which might show that she had encouraged him a little. He only smiled. "You talk of loving me," she said, drawing back from him with a look of reproach, "and you don't even believe what I say to you." She stopped and looked behind her with a faint cry of alarm. Hurried footsteps were audible on the other side of the evergreens that screened them. Emilius stepped back to a turn in the path and discovered Phoebe. "Don't stay a moment longer, sir," cried the girl. "I've been in the house, and Mrs. Ormond isn't there, and nobody knows where she is. Get out by the gate, sir, while you have the chance." Emilius returned to Regina. "I mustn't get the girl into a scrape," he said. "You know where to write to me. Goodbye." Regina made a sign to the maid to retire. Emilius had never taken leave of her as he was taking leave of her now. She forgot the fervent embrace and the daring kisses. She was desperate at the bare idea of losing him. "Oh, Emilius, don't doubt that I love you. Say you believe I love you. Kiss me before you go." He kissed her, but not as he had kissed her before. He said the words she wanted him to say, but only to please her, not with all his heart. She let him go. Reproaches would be wasted at that moment. Phoebe found her pale and unmovable, rooted to the spot on which they had parted. Dear me, miss, what's gone wrong?" And her mistress answered wildly in words that had never before passed her placid lips. "Oh, Phoebe, I wish I was dead." Such was the impression left on the mind of Regina by the interview in the shrubbery. The impression left on the mind of Emilius was stated in equally strong language later in the day. His American friend asked innocently for news, and was answered in these terms: "Find something to occupy my mind, Rufus, or I shall throw the whole thing over and go to the devil." The wise man from New England was too wise to trouble Emilius with questions under these circumstances. "Is that so?" was all he said. Then he put his hand in his pocket, and producing the letter, laid it quietly on the table. "For me?" Emilius asked. "You wanted something to occupy your mind," the wily Rufus answered. "There 'tis." Emilius read the letter. It was dated Hampton Institution. The secretary invited Emilius, in highly complimentary terms, to lecture in the hall of the institution on Christian socialism as taught and practiced in the community at Tadmor. He was offered 2/3 of the profits derived from the sale of places, and was left free to appoint his evening, at a week's notice, and to issue his own advertisements. Minor details were reserved to be discussed with the secretary when the lecturer had consented to the arrangement proposed to him. Having finished the letter, Emilius looked at his friend. "This is your doing," he said. Rufus admitted it with his customary candor. He had a letter of introduction to the letter, and he had called by appointment that morning. The institution wanted something new to attract the members and the public. Having no present intention of lecturing himself, he had thought of Emilius and had spoken his thought.
"I mentioned," Rufus added slyly, "that I didn't reckon you would mount the platform, but he's a sanguine creature, that secretary, and he said he'd try."
"Why should I say no?" Emilius asked a little irritably. "The secretary pays me a compliment and offers me an opportunity of spreading our principles. Perhaps," he added more quietly after a moment's reflection, "you thought I might not be equal to the occasion, and in that case I don't say you were wrong." Rufus shook his head.
"If you had passed your life in this decrepit little island," he replied, "I might have doubted you, likely enough, but Tadmore's situated in the United States. If they don't practice the boys in the art of orating, don't you tell me there's an American citizen with a voice in that society. Yes again, my son, you won't? Well, then 'twas Uncle Farnaby I had in my mind. I said to myself, not to the secretary, Emilius is bound to consider Uncle Farnaby. Oh my, what would Uncle Farnaby say?"
The hot temper of Emilius took fire instantly. "What the devil do I care for Farnaby's opinions?" he burst out. "If there's a man in England who wants the principles of Christian socialism beaten into his thick head, it's Farnaby. Are you going to see the secretary again?"
"I might look in," Rufus answered, "in the course of the evening."
"Tell him I'll give the lecture with my compliments and thanks. If I can only succeed," pursued Emilius, hearing himself with the new idea, "I may make a name as a lecturer, and a name means money, and money means beating Farnaby with his own weapons. It's an opening for me, Rufus, at the crisis of my life."
"That is so," Rufus admitted. "I may as well look up the secretary."
"Why shouldn't I go with you?" Emilius suggested.
"Why not?" Rufus agreed.
They left the house together.